Welcome to another episode of Soaring Sisters. This time we're back to airworthiness. We're going to be having a look at the annual inspection on my glider, Papa India India, a Pegase 101A. Let's go! Before we go and look at this episode, I just want to say I had all kinds of trouble filming this particular episode. I know I promised it for a long time, and I've managed to put together the best episode I can, but I had all kinds of trouble. I think every YouTuber from time to time has a problem when all of your camera equipment refuses to behave, and that was the situation for me. I also had extreme difficulty trying to keep cameras mounted in places where they provided, optimal viewing of the work that I was doing. I often had to hand hold a camera while trying to do work, all of which was not ideal. My professional cinema camera, which is behind me on a tripod here, refused to behave itself, corrupted SD cards. I did an interview with one of my club members, Dominique, about her desire to do more airworthiness work. She was there with her husband doing the annual inspection on a discus, and that interview didn't come out. So it's been quite a drama. Now, before we go and have a look at this episode, please be sure to hit the subscribe button, tap on the bell to be notified of new episodes. But right now, let's go. It's a beautiful time of year here in Australia. We are entering spring. The flowers are coming out. The sun is staying up longer. And what that means for me is it's time for my annual inspection on my sailplane. Now, you might think that an annual inspection means you get the glider and you pull it apart and you start working on it if you're suitably qualified to do so. But in actual fact, the annual inspection starts long before you ever touch the glider. There's an old saying in aviation that an aircraft isn't airworthy until the mass of paperwork exceeds the mass of the aircraft. And that's definitely true in gliding as it is in any other form of aviation. So, of course, the annual inspection starts with paperwork. Although these days, a lot of that so-called paperwork is, of course, online. So let's start there. That mass of paperwork is made up of a great number of documents. The most significant ones are, of course, the aircraft's own logbook, which, in my case, looks rather ratty. Unfortunately, the previous owner didn't treat it with a lot of respect. I don't think it got wet somehow. Drives me crazy, but anyway, that's the way it is. And of course, this has a lot of the history of the aircraft recorded in here. And in fact, before you even buy an aircraft, you should really check through all of this history. What I miss about the present way of recording in logbooks is the departure from recording every single flight. I think when you go back and read some of the vintage glider logbooks, it's terribly exciting reading. People trying to do these amazing, 300-kilometer flight in something that's got the glide ratio of a stone. Anyway, that logbook is necessary. The certificate of airworthiness, the type certificate data sheet, the manuals, maintenance manuals, pilot operating handbooks, all kinds of things manuals, any certifications for any modifications. And in Australia, BSE, Basic Sailplane Engineering, is kind of like replacing a lot of the old ADs. So, what's an AD? An AD is an Airworthiness Directive. An AN is an Airworthiness Notification. And I don't have those right to hand, but you'll actually be required to do a search of those. And these days you can do that online. You'll need to do the search every year just to make sure there aren't new versions issued or new ADs. This particular year in Australia there was a new AD, correct me if I get it wrong, 688 I think it was, which referred to corrosion of elevator push rods. Anyway, one of the things that's really important is to be well organised, whether it's your aircraft or someone else's. Try to have your or their paperwork sorted and be really familiar with it. So here's all the certificates, the type certificate data sheet, the certificate of airworthiness, flight manual and all those kinds of things in here. If you're doing a course or you're doing an accreditation, such as we do here in Australia, and is recorded in your Airworthiness Schedule of Experience booklet, one of the things that's really important to understand is that the people who are assessing you and training you aren't just working out whether you have, mechanical skills or something else. One of the most important skills of all is the ability to be self-critical, and even more so than you might think you already are in terms of being a pilot. You need to be sure of what your knowledge is not. Does that make sense? You need to know what you don't know. Don't assume you know things. Also be really curious. If this has happened, what does that mean? And if you don't know yourself or can't work it out yourself, then if you demonstrate that you're the kind of person who won't progress until you worked out what's happened, until you've determined if this has some meaning or other, has it resulted in damage, then you're going to be considered the kind of person that is careful enough to be doing airworthiness inspections. That's kind of how it works. Now, I can't speak for every other country and what the processes are, so bear in mind, whatever you do, if you're thinking you might be interested in doing airworthiness, talk to your local people and see what you can learn about the processes locally. Another thing that's important here in Australia is when you apply or pay for your kit each year, it comes with a checklist of work that's typically done, and you sign it all out, or the person who's authorised signs it all out. In this particular case, I had 2 copies, so as I went through and did each work, I put my signature there to demonstrate that I had checked it, made any notations that are required. And then when the person who was authorised, who was supervising me, was certain that, I had done everything and it was all correct, they could go through then and do their own check and sign things out. So in the case of myself, my last annual inspection, this one that I'm reporting on, was done under supervision, and I did it from start to finish, unlike previous ones more recently where I've done bits and pieces. However, I had done 21 different airworthiness inspections in my lifetime, again all under supervision, but at the particular time the structure here in Australia wasn't one that gave people a lot of faith about being responsible for signing somebody out as being capable, so I never actually got signed out. I was one of the voices that really called for change way back then in the 80s and 90s, I think. I can't remember now, but I'm sure someone in the GFA, if they're watching this, will go, "Oh, I remember. She did too. She was being quite a nuisance." Anyway, so that's the paperwork side of things. Once we got my glider inside the hangar, with the wings on stands and a fuselage supported, we took the adjustable seat panel out. And as you can see, there was a lot of dust there. Those of you who are present at the Women's Worlds will know exactly where that came from. We then went ahead and removed the seat pan itself and the panel exposing the main wheel. This allows access to the control stops and lots of other things. Okay, so quick summary. What we've managed to do today is check the control deflections while the glider was outside and rigged. We checked the control free play. We then brought the de-rigged the glider, and then brought it inside here, set the wings up on stand, set the fuselage up, and we started on the fuselage first. Pulled the seat panel out and checked everything in there, gave it a good clean. Check all of the structure. There's a couple of ADs with respect to structure that really only are required if the aircraft has had a heavy landing, and since I'm the only pilot flying, I pretty much know whether it's had a heavy landing or not. But anyway, I checked them anyway because they're right there in front of you. Lubed a couple of things, did a bit of tidy up in the cockpit, checked for FOD, lubricated the cable releases. Cable releases are 2,500 launches away from a spring replacement, so we didn't bother doing that at this point. Then did this, a cable release check, and then we did check inside the area of the fuselage where the wings fit and made sure that structure was all good. The AD for the air brake cracking, would do that anyway, even though it was done previously. I can't remember if the AD called for it to be done every year, so I just did it anyway. Then we did the ASI calibration, which we just finished up, and did the static port to check that the static system doesn't leak. So yeah, we're pretty much done for the day, I think. As always, the days start early. Here we are on day 2, and yesterday I did the static check. So before I show you any more of what I'm going to do on day 2, let's show you what I did for the static check and for the ASI calibration before I get around to putting the cockpit back together. So let's go. Now what we're doing is a static check. So we've plumbed into the static. We've covered over both sets of static ports, and we set up a vacuum in the manometer. So what we're going to do is watch if that goes down over a period of time, and it hasn't. So then we'll let the static ports out. Let's see which ones are active. Are these ones active? They certainly are. There you go. So now let me explain the manometer and how we check that the ASI is reading correctly. Piece of equipment you can see here is what's called a water manometer. It's essentially just a U-tube that has a movable calibration scale, which is presently clamped using that vice clamp. And the principle is that the column of water has a certain weight and therefore provides a certain amount of pressure, and that's the standard. So you can actually use it to check the calibration of instruments that are in some way or other measuring air pressure, so airspeed indicators and so forth, altimeters and all those kinds of things obviously use air pressure, and they're very low pressures, so they're measured in sort of centimeters of water. So what you can do is you can zero this scale here, and then using a syringe that's plumbed into this device, you can apply pressure to make the manometer scale move. Now it won't move because I haven't got it hooked up to anything. Maybe if I block off one end of the tube. So by reading where that column comes to, which is calibrated to match the increments on the airspeed indicator, for instance, you can get a measure of the calibration of the airspeed, and you can check it going upwards and then going downwards, which checks for something called hysteresis. So that's what we did yesterday with the ASI, and then what I also did was I taped off the static ports here, which are in the side of the fuselage. There's another set back in the tail, and we removed some of the plumbing here that's plumbed into those static ports, connected the manometer to them, pressurized the system. I actually applied a vacuum to the system using the manometer, and then checked that it didn't leak over time. Then once we did that, we checked that it wasn't blocked by removing the tape and off these static ports, and the system pressure should normalise, which it did. So that check has been done. Okay, so here we are, middle of day 2, and we've just finished some work on the undercarriage doors. So I'll take you through a little bit of that, and some work also on the underside of the fuselage. Behringer wheel that we fitted last year, and I've never been entirely happy with the installation, I have to tell you. And in particular we had to modify one of the doors. So you can see this door pusher here that both pushes the door out and prevents it shutting, and these bungees which act as the spring. On the other side, because it's got a brake caliper, that pusher had to be removed because it got in the way of the brake system. So we got this modification approved by the appropriate people. We made it so that the door actually hangs in this position now, and in order to prevent it fouling on the brake caliper, we had to make this little slide mechanism. So that's an approved modification, but I've never quite been happy with it. So we've modified the bungees here to allow them to pull the doors more tightly closed. Now the other thing is, obviously with an older glider there was a little bit of scratching here. Now I'm not approved to do this work, but I've been doing it under supervision to just put a bit of flow coat back on the underside where the scratches were. Similarly, there's a couple back here that we've done as well. So bottom's looking a little tired, but when we do the refinish next year, it will be pretty good. The wings are not in such good condition. You can probably make out the longitudinal cracks running this way in the gel coat. Been inspected by a number of people, and while it's not pretty, it's not actually at this point a problem, but the wing will need a refinish. Strangely enough, it's on the bottom, not on the top, so it's not UV that's doing it. And there's a theory here that some of these gliders, both Schleicher and Centra, actually rushed the production of them, put a bunch of hardener in, pulled them out of the mould too soon. That's one theory. I don't say that I have enough experience, despite having quite a bit of experience working with fibre reinforced plastic. I've never done it with aircraft, it's always boats. So I'm not sure on that theory, but there you go. So now we're going to give it a bit more of a polish. We've given it a clean, and then the flow coat should be dry enough for me to give it a bit of a sand, and we should be good to go. So this little job that I've just done here is to check the ballast bags, that the plastic bags that are in the wings that are usually filled with water, to check them for leaks. So the fitting here that allows the water to go in and out is blocked up with a rubber stopper, and the tubing from that rubber stopper is connected to a manometer device, a water tube manometer, so we can check to see that it's holding pressure. And what I had to do was fill a 60-litre plastic bag by blowing through this plastic tube, which is now got a screwdriver stuck on the end of it so that it can't leak. And if that manometer holds pressure, which it's doing, we know that the bags don't leak. Fun and games. Another top tip for the Pegase owners and maybe the ASW 20 owners as well. This seat button screws out, and if it screws out, you can't get the seat in and out. So make sure you check that it's actually screwed right in. Otherwise, when you actuate these levers, you don't get enough movement from the button. Now we're just going to check the D-box and make sure the seam along the front edge here, which sometimes splits with some gliders, is intact. A few chips which we know about, but there's no splits that I can see. We do the same on both wings. Already checked the spars and the fittings to make sure that the fiberglass around them is holding, that there's no unusual wear on the fittings. Inspected the inside of the wings with a torch, and all looks good. Here's a tip for new players. When you're bolting your harness back in, stuff a rag down in the gap there in the seat panel so that you don't drop nuts and washers down into the gap and then have to pull the entire seat panel out again. Been there, done that. So then it's making sure all the hours are up to date in the logbook, transferring across from the maintenance release into the aircraft's own logbook, then making a notation in the logbook with respect to the work done during the annual inspection, and that can actually be quite difficult if you haven't done it before. My advice is, obviously, you won't be doing this for the first time without having, quite a bit of support. And for this particular inspection, I asked for somebody to help me with the wording that would be appropriate. Now, in my logbook, there's also images and so forth from previous years, and I thought I'd take the time to show you that. So here's the repairs that were done around the brake boxes, for instance. It's a really good idea to put as much stuff in your logbook as you can in terms of making other people aware of the work that's been done and making anyone who might purchase the aircraft aware of any work. Then, of course, it's time to make some notations in the brand new maintenance release for the next year, and then onwards to the evaluation flight. Day 3, and we're all done. All the paperwork's done. The glider has been polished. Just got to put the canopy on and rig it. But before I do that, while everyone's still sleeping in, I'm going to go and fix my trailer. Finish fixing my trailer. Day 3 of the airworthiness saga, and you can probably hear it's pouring rain. So that's going to make it a little hard to put the aircraft together because we have to take it outside to do that. So what I'm doing instead, while I wait for the rain to stop, is fitting new tail lights to my trailer door. And then hopefully we'll get a chance to put the glider back together, put it in the hangar, pack up and go home.